Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back at the atrium. Our next guest worked for 8 years in the EU Parliament, and he's an expert at the European Union policies that are all relevant to the cultural and creative sectors. He's a songwriter and a music lover himself, and he's very excited, and we are very excited to have him here. So please welcome together with me, Benjamin Feyen.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Happy to see so many people who are interested in politics, especially taking into consideration that in the other room we still have another really interesting talk going on. I'm here to talk a little bit about what the European Union does for music, for musicians, for the music sector. I will dive a little bit into politics, so I'm even more happy that you're here because as I know myself, being a songwriter and music producer, artists want to create. You know, songwriters want to write songs, artists want to perform, and nobody really cares about the business, and politics is even further away. However, there's a lot that you should be interested in. My general approach will be not to make you interested in politics. I mean, maybe some of you are, but that's not the aim. I just want to make you aware of certain things that are going on so that you've heard about it, that you're familiar with what's going on. Yeah? Okay, let's go to the first slide and a quick overview on what I will talk about. So first of all, why politics and especially EU politics matter at all? Why is it relevant? Second, what the EU does in terms of cultural policies and specifically on music. I should mention already at this stage that cultural policy in a nutshell is basically funding. So the government, be it the European Union or the national government or local government, ideally they don't tell you what to do. They shouldn't tell you what songs to write, what the content should be, etc. So cultural policy essentially means funding. I should also footnote, I'm keeping everything relatively general, so in case there's a lawyer or political scientist in the room, bear with me. My colleagues would probably, I'm a historian and political scientist by education, they would probably kill me for being so shallow, but I think for the purpose of this talk it's fine. So what does the EU do for cultural policy? And we had quite an interesting talk already yesterday on European Union funding. Maybe some of you were there. Maybe just asking, who was there yesterday afternoon? Okay, a couple of people. You might recognize some things here. And then what does the European Union do as well, which is not cultural policy, but of high relevance to musicians and the overall music sector? Okay, but first of all, why am I qualified to talk about this? As Sam just mentioned, I worked at the European Parliament for many years, 8 years and a little bit to be more precise. I worked for several members of the European Parliament, that is elected politicians. In my case, I'm originally from Germany. I worked for several German politicians, and some of them were involved also in cultural policies, media policies. So I've done quite a lot regarding that. And including the Creative Europe program that maybe some of you have already heard of. That was part of the talk yesterday. Essentially, I will dive more into that later, but essentially it's the European Union program to support the culture and creative sectors. So I negotiated that. The current program, it always runs for 7 years. I negotiated the current one that will run for another 2 years, and then the next one will come. Back when I was a policy advisor to a Green German member of the European Parliament. Maybe at this stage, just very briefly, are you familiar with what the European Parliament does, what the European Commission, we heard it at the talk that Luc just gave an hour ago, and the European Commission? I just assume you don't know nothing about it, so very briefly, similarly, and again my political scientists and lawyer colleagues will probably kill me for what I'm saying now, but essentially the European Commission is kind of the government of the European Union, and then we have two legislative bodies. One is the Parliament, which is directly elected. Hopefully you voted last year when we had European elections. in middle of last year. And then there's also the council, which is like a second chamber of the parliament representing the member states. So each of the European Union member states have somebody representing them in the council, and the parliament and the council together, they make the law. The European Commission proposes the law and then implements it. So with regards to the example Creative Europe, it was the European Commission that wrote down the law. It's called a regulation. It's hundreds of pages. They sent their proposal to both the European Parliament and the and the Council, in which the culture ministers were represented of the member states. So the Belgian Minister of Culture was there, etc. And then both the Parliament and the Council negotiated that internally, and that was my role to negotiate it and to bring up amendments, changes, delete things. I did that on behalf of the Greens within the European Parliament, or actually on behalf of my boss who was nominated, but let's not dive too much into details here. And then the European Commission, which made the original proposal, the European Parliament representatives, and the representatives from the Council, they meet together and then they discuss the three different versions and come up with a final result that needs to be approved again. So it's a process that takes years. And actually right now they are starting, the European Commission is just working on the proposal for the next generation, let's say. But more on that later. But just so that you have a general idea where to put the European Parliament in politics. By the way, if you have any questions, raise your hand and we can go directly into that or after my talk. The Cultural Creators Friendship Group, that was my last job. It was a group of, at our peak, we had 29 individual members of the European Parliament from 14 different countries, 6 different political groups. So we had someone from the Conservatives, from the Liberals, from the left, from Socialists, Greens, and from 14 different countries. And with that group, you could call it like a lobby group of politicians within the parliament. It's a bit weird, but the idea was to push for, or to go into legislation that affects you guys. And so we try to raise awareness of certain topics. For example, music streaming is something that I pushed for already 5-6 years ago, where I told my bosses, okay, this is something where we should take a closer look. And that actually helps, being a songwriter myself and music producer, that I'm quite aware, and I go to lots of conferences like this, that I would say I have my eyes and ears relatively close to those who create music. So that helped a lot. And with this group, we organized a lot of conferences. We pushed the European Commission to do certain things, etc. We talk about the topics in a second. So far about me, and currently I don't have a job. I'm taking some time off and focus on making music, which is really nice for the first time in my life. Okay, so why does it matter at all? Essentially, when I talk to people, when I explain what I do, or when I say that I work in politics, quite often I get the reaction, I don't care about politics really. It's boring and they are corrupt anyways and they do what they want and they just want to get re-elected, blah, blah, blah. Which is not completely wrong, but essentially what is politics? If I don't use the definition that I learned in my political science studies, or if we leave away all the technical knowledge, essentially politics is setting up rules how we as a society want to live together. So it can be anything. It can be even in a relationship or in a family or amongst friends, if you decide where to go on holidays or which movie to watch or which music to listen to. That's also kind of politics at the micro level. So politics is how do we as a society want to live together. And if you think about it, it's actually absurd to say I don't care about that or not to vote. And here I've listed a few topics that are actually quite relevant, that are being decided politically. And since we live in a representative democracy, that means you vote for people So you don't have to be the experts, but you vote for people that you think represent you the best. And those are the politicians. So when we talk about, for example, working conditions, freedom of the arts, it's not a big topic here in Belgium, I guess, nor in Germany, where I'm from. But for example, if we look at Hungary, we don't have to leave the European Union. If we look at Hungary, I don't know how much you're following that, but the Prime Minister Viktor Orban is kind of a mini Putin, or he want to be Putin. So he really suppresses a lot of artists, especially those that are critical about him. Other countries, Poland, for example, has had a quite conservative government for many years. If you did anything as an artist, anything pro-LGBTQI plus people, for example, you might face serious trouble. And even if you were not directly suppressed, just not receiving or not having the chance to receive public funding from the Polish government in this case, or from the Hungarian government, that alone is already a restriction of freedom of expression, of freedom of the arts. And then, obviously, there are other examples, like you cannot play in a club because they don't like your music. You can still publish your music on Spotify, maybe, but freedom of the arts, I would say, is an issue in the European Union. Social welfare. If you don't have a job, for example, take the pandemic. For many years, artists were struggling, and many still are. And many artists don't really fit into the, let's say, typical job scheme. So, for example, if you're a musician in an orchestra, you're not really unemployed when you don't go on stage, because you need to practice every day. If you don't practice, you lose your knowledge or your skills. But that was a tricky situation during the pandemic. That took some time for politicians or also for the administration to catch up with and to adopt the rules so that they fit, for example, musicians. International mobility. You're all probably quite aware of the Brexit, which caused a lot of problems. Luckily, within the European Union, we have freedom of movement. So you can just play a gig in Germany, or a German coming to Belgium playing here. That's no problem. But already when you go to the United Kingdom, that's not that easy anymore. So it's all something that's really relevant, but that's not cultural policies. Another example, legal environment. Copyright. Hopefully all heard the word already. I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. Contracts, how contracts can be set up. That's all in a way regulated by the political level. Remuneration rules, music streaming, touched upon that already. Regulation of technological progress. AI is a big topic, and ideally used as a nice tool to help you to produce or to write songs, or in other ways, but especially when it comes to generative AI, we have a real problem here. And I briefly talked about that a few minutes ago, that if we as a society, for example, we can clone human beings. Technically, that's possible, but we as a society agree that it's unethical. What about having a machine create cultural content? I'm really missing a public debate on whether that's ethical, I'm not taking a position here, but I think we should have a public debate, and I'm missing that. It's just starting. ChatGPT really helped to push the public debate, but it's not really there. But the question of how we regulate that is a political question. So you see, politics matters, and all of what I've mentioned is actually something where the European Union has the competence for. While culture is mostly national competence. It's basically, in a nutshell, the member states think that culture, and also education is another example, it's something that's a lot that concerns national identity. So they're really hesitant to give power. By the way, the European Union, or at the union level, they only have the competences that the member states give to them. The member states are still sovereign in the European Union. That's something, I don't know if some of you might have followed all the discussions around Brexit a couple of years ago. There was the slogan of taking back control, which is completely stupid because the UK has always been in control, has always been a sovereign state. So all of the European Union member states are still sovereign. They decide which powers or which competences to give to the European Union. We have the European treaties for that. And then, of course, in aspects where it's a little bit unclear, there have to be some negotiations, or the European Court, the Court of the European Union, sorry, has to decide whether the European Union has competences. But in principle, member states are competent. And so with regards to culture, the EU can only do something that has a cross-border dimension, a European dimension. And yeah, I will talk a little bit about that later. Any questions at this stage? Seems to be not the case. So, just one example on why it matters, the Copyright Directive from 2019. Who of you has heard of it? It's been 6 years already, but some of you, Copyright Directive, Article 13. You see a nice picture there. Okay, thank you. So most of you haven't heard of it. The idea was that, again, it's very simplified. The idea was that everything that's legal or illegal offline should also be legal or illegal online, and it should be possible to enforce that. Because having rules is one thing, enforcing them is another one. And there was a huge fight because many, as you can imagine, many big companies, and we're talking about the big companies really, like Apple, Meta, Facebook back then, Google, YouTube, they were all against it. And they managed to convince the majority or many users, especially teenagers, that this piece of legislation would lead to the destruction of the internet. And the internet wouldn't be as free anymore as we are used to it. And the debate about the so-called article, or so-called upload filter debate, which was on Article 13, you see a nice picture there, Save Our Internet, was that the platforms claimed that if this legislation enters into force, they would have to implement upload filters so that everything that you upload would be scanned and possibly, in case of copyright infringement, would get rejected. That caused a lot of problems, and that was the narrative. And a lot of young people, if you're 14 and you're used to uploading a nice video on, I don't know, TikTok, you dance to music, yeah, then you wanted to go online immediately. And the fear was that this would not happen anymore, this would not be possible anymore. And the thing is that all the platforms already have their terms and conditions. And there are other reasons why they would scan content that is being uploaded. Child pornography, for example, or terrorist content, many other reasons, many other aspects. So they do scan everything already. So this piece of legislation wouldn't really bring any new technical measures, but the narrative was, it does. And so we had lots of protests, especially in Germany. There was a German member of the European Parliament from the Pirate Party. I don't know if you've heard of the Pirate Party. It's a relatively small party in many European countries. And that person was quite young, quite nerdy, let's say, quite authentic, wasn't the typical 70-year-old white man from the Conservatives, so managed to reach out successfully to a lot of teenagers to get them on the street. And so in Germany we had more than, Germany was the country where there were the biggest protests. In some other countries there were protests as well, but in Germany partly over 100,000 mostly young people went on the street to demonstrate against that. And this is where the picture was taken. Unfortunately, musicians stayed relatively silent. I discussed it yesterday with some of you, that musicians or artists in general, my impression is that it's difficult to convince artists to speak out publicly about something political. Especially when it's about a certain, I mean, everybody would say, yeah, I support peace. I'm against the war in Ukraine, for example. But when it comes to specific legislation or siding with one political party, for instance, we don't really have this protest culture in culture anymore that we had, for example, in the 70s when we talked about the Vietnam War and things like that. You could claim that it's similar to the war in Ukraine, but in principle, I think it's really difficult to get artists to speak out and demonstrate. And so it was really tight in the end, and with a narrow majority, we managed to get this legislation through. And as we all know, the internet still exists. You can still upload things. But one thing has changed, and that is that in previous times, I should have mentioned that a little bit earlier, when you're the 14-year-old dancing to a song, you should actually, according to the law, you would have to contact the publisher and the label, ask for permission. Can I use the song? Which no 14-year-old knows. And even if they knew, they would probably not care about that. While the big platforms were making the money. And so at the core of this legislation is a shift from the responsibility and liability from the users or the uploaders to the big platforms. Ideally, or the idea was to force them to have big contracts with content management organizations like Sabam, for example. And I think so far it's been turning out successful. Unfortunately, a directive, one more sentence on that, a directive is like a framework law at the European level where all the member states need to come up with their own law within that framework. There's another kind of legislation which is a directive, which is a regulation which enters immediately into effect at the European level. So we would have the same rules across the European Union. Unfortunately, it's not the case here, which I think is a big criticism that many share, even the big platforms, because ideally YouTube has the same rules for across the EU. So just to give you an example on why it's actually important, let me just check the time. I think I'm still quite good. Okay, let's go more into what the EU does in terms of cultural policies. And as I said before, it's mostly about funding. The EU can do a few other things. And is actually written in the EU treaty, which is like the constitution of the European Union. The European Union can take action that supports the member states in their activities, or also everything that's related to the cultural heritage. That can be heritage sites like old castles or something like that, but that can also be other content. And so the European Union has come up with a few things that it does. For example, the European Capitals of Culture, you probably heard of that already. The European Heritage Label, Heritage Days, is something that the European Union does. Several prizes for culture, for example, there's a European Union Prize for Literature to help emerging writers. And funding is one thing, but the EU can also fund the distribution of works. So for example, with the European Prize for Literature, the books or the text that they write would be translated. So for example, from Estonian into French or English or German or Flemish. I don't know Flemish, Dutch for sure. And then most importantly, Creative Europe, which I mentioned earlier, is the EU program to support the culture and creative sectors. And so in a nutshell, as I said earlier, it runs for 7 years. At the moment we are kind of in the middle, and the budget is 2.44 billion euros for this 7 years. Sounds like a lot, but it's roughly 0.25% of the overall European Union budget. Well, and that's for everything. It's not just music. It's also for the film industry, for the books publishing sector, video games, etc., etc. And the whole sector is about 7 to 8% of the overall gross domestic product of the European Union. So the number of 0.25% is actually really small. So it sounds like a lot, but I think it would be closer to like around 70 billion would be more adequate with regards to the size of the sector. Also the economical meaning. I mean, it's not just about culture. That's the interesting thing about what we all do. It's on the one hand, it's cultural content. It's about our identity as a society. It reflects what we do, who we are, but it's also an industry. Um, there are several sub-strands, they call it strands, in the program, and so around 1/3 of the budget goes into the culture strand. That's where music is put. Book sector would be another, theater, etc. Yeah, diversity, creativity, innovation in the music sector is one of the things it wants to achieve. It's a lot of. I was there yesterday when there was the talk about EU funding, and those of you who were there remember maybe that I forgot her name now, but she said that you need to meet the EU speech when you apply, for example, for grants. So this is all this. It's a lot of blah blah, but of course it needs to be justified in some way, and there needs to be a common language, also something that is legally okay. So that's why there are specific terms or specific aims that sound very abstract. But that's why I think it's nice maybe to give you an example of how it works. In total, over the 7 years, more than 100 projects in music are supported. For example, platforms, networks, also music conferences can benefit from that. And I decided to give you the example of Live Europe. Who of you has heard of Live Europe before? Okay, just 3, 4. Live Europe is a network of, I think, 24 music venues across Europe. Not only the EU, but also I think they have members in the UK, Ukraine, Switzerland. So it's which is possible because the Creative Europe program is also not restricted to the European Union. Other countries can join, and I think just last week I read that also Moldova has now made a contract with the EU to join the Creative Europe program, which is quite nice. So it's beyond the EU. So what does Live Europe do? Essentially, they have a bonus mechanism so that a venue, or let's start the other way. You're a band from Finland. You want to play in Belgium. By the way, the Belgian member, they have only one member per country. In Belgium, it's the Ancien Belgique in Brussels. You're a Finnish band, you want to play at the Ancien Belgique in Brussels. How do you do that? Well, you might call them, your manager, if you have a manager, if you're lucky, call the organizers of Ancien Belgique. They will say, well, you're from Finland, nobody knows you here. I would have 10 people coming, maybe some Finnish experts or something like that, but I don't want to take that risk. That's where Live Europe jumps in. So on the one hand, they support it financially, which reduces the risk of the venue, and also is some kind of safety net, so that they can be relatively sure that they will not make a loss. And that, of course, is a motivation to do it again and again. And so over the years, Live Europe, I think, has been existing for 10, 11 years now. I think last year they had their 10th anniversary. They have supported more than 5,000 acts from, I think, 40 different European countries. That's a lot. And they do it with relatively little money, because, of course, the venue still has to pay the singer or the artist, so they don't cover everything, but they try to reduce the risk. And so they invest relatively little money. I'm not sure, I don't want to give you any wrong information, but I think I heard the number of around €1,000 per concert. So it's really not much if it's a big venue such as Ancien Belgique. Maybe some of you have been there. So I think that's a really good, relatively simple easy to understand example for a project that the European Union funds with the Creative Europe program. Any questions? Yes, please. For Creative Europe or for Live Europe?
Live Europe.
Live Europe.
Do they support any band? Or what are the criteria for support?
Yeah, so Live Europe has to follow the rules for Creative Europe, and so, for example, there's always has to be a cooperation between several countries. So, for example, it cannot be a Belgian band playing at the Ancien Belgique. That's not possible. I think there's a criteria that the first release cannot have been more than 5 years ago, so it has to be to make sure that it's a relatively new emerging artist. I think there are 2, 3 other criteria, but I would have to look that up. But it's a good question. So there are certain criteria also for to get funds in general, but yeah, I don't know if the slide with no, wasn't there yet. Let's go to the next slide, because there's also something else that is funded by Creative Europe, and again, it was already mentioned yesterday in the talk. Culture Moves Europe. It's a relatively new initiative. I think it started 3 years, 2022, right? Yes. It's some kind of, maybe you know Erasmus, the Erasmus program, the famous student exchange program of the European Union. So very oversimplified, it's like Erasmus for artists. As an individual artist or as a small group of up to, I think it's up to 5 people, yes, up to 5 people. So for example, a small band, you can go somewhere for, I think it's up to 40 days for individual artists or up to 2 weeks for bands and get funding from this project. And that's a relatively new approach to make it smaller, because in the years before it was possible only for networks projects or bigger projects who had their own funds. In this case, it's really like the easiest way of individual artists or bands to get some funding, and also because talking about the preconditions to apply or to get funding, they're relatively low. Yeah? And it's also, yes, also support to residences or organizations that organize it. And so since the start of this Culture Moves Europe initiative, 7,000, you can see the number there, probably by now it's a little bit more, 7,000 artists, groups, cultural professionals. So it doesn't have to be artists, it can be like managers as well, it can be anybody who works in the cultural cultural contexts and hosts. I think that's quite an impressive number, and I would encourage you to look into that if you haven't done it yet. By the way, if you have any questions after this presentation, don't hesitate to approach me. Yeah, there was a question.
Hello.
Oh, maybe there. Sorry.
Hello,
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah, sure.
Since COVID and post-COVID, music is discovered through different platforms such as TikTok, which you mentioned. How does the EU political policy support musicians? When is it, when music is now discoverable through these different platforms? How does the government meet the musicians on the ground and TikTok music, like people who get discovered on TikTok, for example?
Very good question, and I will actually come to that on, I think, on the next slide already, or the slide after. So if I don't answer your question during my talk, please remind me of your question. There was another one up there.
There are a lot of professional people making really good music and deserve support. But there are also thousands and thousands and thousands of guys like me who play in local bands, who just want to have fun, who just want to find nice gigs, who just want to find little small venues, not Ancien Belgique, just a pub to play for 100 people, and then we are satisfied. And all I see now is venues are closing. 15 years ago, Antwerp only, I could easily drive to 20 places and sell my band. I think there are 3 left now. So it's really difficult for a guy like me to have fun. It's not about money, it's about fun, but to find places. And I don't think these venues get any support at all to keep them alive and to make it happen that local bands like what I do can have fun and play. And that's, for me, it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I fully agree. I have 2 answers to that question. First part of the answer, as I mentioned earlier, the European Union has only quite limited competence. So when we talk about direct support to venues, that's something you would have to talk to the regional or national federal government too. So the European Union cannot just give money directly. So that's the one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that the European Union did set up a few things, for example, to combat the consequences of COVID, of the pandemic. So the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility, boring term, RRF. That was a 700 billion package, which was adopted, I think, like 3 years ago, by which the European Union supports exactly those, let's say it's a big pot at the European Union level, and the member states can take money from it. But that again would be a thing of the federal government or the regional government, I think the federal government in this case. There are also other ways of funding that the European Union does and can do. For example, the transition from, let's say, regions that were heavily industrial, like coal and steel regions, to turn those old buildings into modern areas. For example, to take an old factory and turn it into a club, for example. That's something that the European Union can also fund, because it's not about culture, it's about transition. Yeah? There's a fund called the so-called Just Transition Fund, where there's a lot of money, much more than there is in Creative Europe, for example. So if you have a if you have an old factory and you want to turn it into a club or into a cinema or something like that, you can get funding from that as well. But to answer directly the question that you addressed, that's more something that you would have to talk to the regional or federal government to, unfortunately.
All I see, the local scene, it's dying.
Yeah, or the local government, actually. Yeah.
Nothing is happening. That's all I can see.
Yeah. And I think there's a big problem, because it's nothing new. I mean, I think the pandemic has only exposed things that were already wrong in the whole sector. So it has like amplified everything, but it was a problem already before. But I think this also touches upon the question on how we as a society see culture, and also how politicians, and I'm also talking about local politicians here, see the importance of culture. Yeah? And when I talk to politicians, I've never heard the sentence, "I don't care about culture." Like everybody, like even the farthest right politician or the farthest left, they care about culture. They might have different interpretations or definitions of culture, but they all care about culture. But when it comes to actual commitments, and in the case of funding, it's financial commitments, then suddenly a lot of other things are important, and it's difficult. Yeah. It's frustrating, to be honest. And for example, with the just one more sentence, with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the 700 billion post-COVID package that the EU has come up with the group that I worked for, the Cultural Creators Friendship Group, and together with a lot of our closest allies were actually the European umbrella organizations of national organizations. So Sabam is member of JSAC at the European level, and I work together with JSAC, for example. Yeah? Or the EXA, the European Composers and Songwriters Alliance, or International Artists Organization, and many others. We fought for 2% dedicating 2% of the 700 billion package to culture, because I don't think I have to tell you that the cultural sector, and especially music, and especially live music, was the heaviest impacted by the pandemic. So it would only have been fair to give 2%, which would have been 35 billion roughly, to a sector that actually makes up 7 to 8% of the gross domestic product. Yeah? So that would still have been only little. Like realistically, you would have said like, okay, it's 7-8% of the GDP. They are mostly affected, so let's give them 20% or something. That would have been like common sense, I would claim. But then again, try to convince politicians to commit to funding for culture. Did I answer your question, or do you have another? I think you wanted to comment or have a follow-up question, or yeah? Okay. Any other question? Otherwise, I'll move on with the next slide. Okay. Yep. Then there is Music Moves Europe. I know it's really culture moves Europe, music moves Europe. It's really confusing sometimes. Music Moves Europe is, as you can see, the overarching EU. Basically, everything the EU does for music is kind of put together under this name, under this brand, let's say. And it's really a brand, because everything under it is like split up in several parts. It's partly funding, mostly Creative Europe. It's partly policy. Things like the copyright directive that I mentioned is like technically put under Music Moves Europe, but it's more like brand. Smart way to promote it, but it's still like splattered and all over the place. The aim is to create a sustainable European music ecosystem. So at least there's the awareness that everything is related and interconnected. That's already a step forward. I think it was different 20, 30 years ago. One thing one initiative that you might have heard of is the annual MME, Music Moves Europe Awards. That are, I think it has been in Groningen at the Eurosonic ESNS conference festival for several years, that there were the awards, and the idea is to support emerging artists from across Europe. And in the long term, the idea is to develop an integrated EU policy approach on music, but that's boring stuff, so I don't want to bother you with that anymore, unless you have any questions. Let's move on. We talked about AI already. So I will give you a few examples now what the European Union does for music that is not culture. Like, that is not cultural policy. As I said in the beginning, cultural policy is mostly funding or funding related. Now we talk about, let's say, proper legislation. And again, please don't tell the people working in the Cultural Committee of the European Parliament. I gave you some examples at the beginning, and artificial intelligence, or to be more specific, generative AI, I think you're all aware of, is a big threat and maybe also chance, opportunity. The European Union has, 5 minutes. I will quickly rush through it. I mean, you can read the slides yourself. The EU AI Act from last year is the very first piece of legislation to regulate AI, but it's very general, like transparency, compliance with the EU copyright law, but it's very, the idea is more to focus on consumer protection, privacy, etc. So it's not really meant to deal with the music sector. The reason is that the first proposal was like 5-6 years ago. That was years before ChatGPT came up, and the general awareness was there. So at the moment, and at least politicians in the European Parliament have noticed that something more needs to be done. And so just now, I think like next week, there's a deadline for amendments to a draft report that is already online, that was presented before the summer break by Axel Voss, a German conservative politician who has already worked on the copyright directive, so he's quite familiar with everything and has done a great bunch of legislation to support the cultural and creative sectors. It's a report at the moment in the committee that deals with legal issues in the European Parliament, but it will end up being a resolution, which is not legislation. It's more like a political positioning of the European Parliament, but it has a political meaning. So it doesn't have an immediate impact legally, because it's not legislation, but it has a strong political message. So as a next step, maybe the European Commission starts drafting some legislation specifically on generative AI. It's complicated process that takes years, so you won't feel the immediate impact of that. But at the European level, and also I guess at the national level, the organizations, for example, SABAM, they are working to doing their best to represent your interest there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Music streaming, I mentioned that already. The European Parliament made a resolution. I'll basically skip this. Basically, more fair conditions for musicians, especially also for authors. The value chains within the music business are not really made for the digital era as well. So, for example, when we talk about distribution, back in the days, distributors had big factory or big halls where they stored all the records. Now everything a lot is done digitally. So there's some things to improve, but again, this is not finished yet. It's an ongoing political process. We have the status of the artist, which is another element touching upon social protection, working conditions, contractual situations, and the European Parliament has been pushing for common European standards for, I think, since the 90s already. And the last big piece of a big document that the European Parliament published and negotiated was 2 years ago with a report on that. So it's up to the European Commission now that is in charge of proposing legislation. But here you can also imagine that it's again the member states represented in the council that are a little bit hesitant to give more power to the European Union or to harmonize things more. But there are several success stories that are actually obvious. I didn't even put the common currency, the euro, on there, but of course you benefit from the euro as well when you travel as an artist. But I did put some other things there, movement for workers, movement for services. So because of the European Union, you are allowed to play in another country. Or let's say the European Union makes it much easier, because otherwise, let's take your case, you're from Berlin, if you want to play in Antwerp, there would have to have been some agreement between Belgium and Germany on how that works. Now everything is kind of harmonized in the EU and you can just go to another country. Coordination of social security systems. So what if you play a gig in another country and something happens? Now that's also harmonized thanks to the EU. We have the digital single market. As you can see, a lot of harmonization of a lot of things, even going into collective rights management, digital releases of music. So if you put your music online, it can be released across the EU and globally as well, but in the EU it's the same conditions. And of course, competition policy, like regulation of big platforms. You might have noticed that in the news maybe every now and then Meta or Google, Alphabet, Apple, they have to pay like €1 million because they did something wrong again. And that actually has an impact on the global policy in a way, the so-called Brussels effect, because the European Union as a whole with 450 million customers is can be politically powerful when we as the EU speak with one voice. Because we play in the same league as the US, as China and others. Belgium on its own or even Germany on its own would never be able to compete with them and have an impact at the global stage. And last few sentences. So what I'd like you to remember from this talk, the EU is crucial to musicians and the music business, several funding opportunities. Very important coming up, the Agora EU program. That's a proposal that the European Commission came up with just recently, and that will kind of replace the Creative Europe program. It's not certain whether the name stays, but it's something to look into maybe, or at least now we have heard about it. It will be negotiated within the next 2 years, so probably you won't hear about it for the next 2 years because it's kind of at the political level, but at least you've heard of it. And in general, especially with regards to what I explained to you about the big debate around the copyright directive, raise your voices and especially support those who support you, which is organizations like songwriter associations, musicians organizations. Musicians Union is one of the partners. Sabam, obviously, mentioned before, because they represent you towards the political sphere. And the more you support them, the stronger they are. And if they ask you to raise your voice and maybe sign a petition or something like that, just go for it. Talk to them if you have any questions, because I think that's very important that we as the music sector speak with one big voice. And that was it. Thank you very much. And if you're interested, check my websites. The first one is more like it's actually a link tree. The first one is more related to my political activities, and the second one if you're interested in my music. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you very much.